Chapter 1: Sherlock Holmes as a visitor. When visitors came to see Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street, they often did surprising things. Sometimes they put their heads in their hands and cried. Sometimes they talked and talked and couldn't stop. And sometimes they just sat there and didn't say a word. But nobody was more surprising than Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable. He was a large man, tall, well-dressed, and important-looking. He came into the room, walked to one of the big chairs, and suddenly fell into it. He sat there with his eyes closed, looking white and ill. I ran to get some water for him, and then I got my doctor's bag and looked at him carefully. "What is it, Watson?" said Holmes. "He's all right, I think," I said. "He's just very, very tired and probably hungry too." So Holmes looked in the man's pockets and found a train ticket from Mackleton in the north of England. "Mackleton? That's a long way," said Holmes. "It's not 12 o'clock yet, so he probably left home before 5 o'clock this morning." After a minute or two, the man began to move, and his eyes opened. A second later, he got quickly to his feet. His face was now red and unhappy. "Mr. Holmes, I am so sorry. I forgot to eat or drink anything this morning. That's why I felt ill." "So when you feel better," I began. "I'm better now, thank you," said our visitor. "And I want very much to talk to Mr. Holmes, to ask him something." "Please, Mr. Holmes, come back to McGalkin with me by the next train." "I'm sorry, that's not possible," said Holmes. "So I'm working on two important cases, the Ferrers case and the Abergavenny case. I cannot leave London at the moment." "Important cases?" our visitor cried. "But this case is very important too. You know about the kidnapping of the son of the Duke of Holderness 3 days ago?" "What? For the government minister?" "Yes, that's him. So you didn't know? It's not in the newspapers yet, that's true. But Sherlock Holmes always hears news before other people, I thought." Holmes went to get one of his books and began to read the page about the Duke of Holderness. Holderness, 6th Duke. Wife, Edith, daughter of Lord Grey. One child, Lord Arthur Saltire. 2 houses in London, Lancashire and Wales. Government minister for this, for that, for the other. Well, said Holmes. He's one of the greatest men in the country. "One of the greatest and one of the richest," said Dr. Huxtable. "I know, Mr. Holmes, that you don't work for money, but I must tell you this. The Duke is offering £5,000 for news of his son, and another £1,000 for the name of his kidnapper. That," said Holmes, "is a most interesting offer." He looked at me. "Watson, I think we are going with Dr. Huxtable back to the north of England this afternoon." Holmes then looked at Dr. Huxtable. "Now, sir, tell me everything. What happened? So when did it happen? How did it happen? And why does Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable come to ask for my help 3 days later?" So our visitor drank some water and began his story. Chapter 2: Dr. Huxtable's Story. "My school, the Priory School near Mackleton, is the best school for young boys in England," began Dr. Huxtable. "We have the sons of Lord Soames, Lord Lever, and of many other important people. 3 weeks ago, Mr. James Wilder, the Duke of Holderness's secretary, came to see me. The Duke, he said, wanted to send his son, the 10-year-old Lord Saltire, to my school. On the 1st of May, young Lord Saltire arrived. He's a nice boy, and he soon began to like school life and to make friends. His life at home, you see, was not very happy. We all know about the Duke and his wife. The Duchess, of course, now lives in the south of France. She left the Duke about 3 months ago, I think. But the boy loved his mother and was very unhappy when she left. Because of this, the Duke sent him to my school. And after 2 weeks with us, he was much happier. Then, on the night of the 13th of May, he disappeared. The way to his bedroom is through another, larger room. 2 older boys sleep there. One of them never sleeps very well, and he heard and saw nothing that night. So young Arthur did not go out through that room. His window was open, and there is ivy all up the wall of the house. It is easy to get out of the window and down the ivy to the ground, so we think that he went out that way. He was in his usual school things, we think, a short black coat and dark blue trousers. We looked all through his room very carefully, but we found nothing strange, nothing unusual. When I learnt the news at 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning, I called everybody into the big schoolroom. Then we learnt more bad news. Heidegger, the German teacher, was missing too. His room is not far from Arthur's room. Heidegger went down the ivy. We know this because we found his footprints on the ground under the window. We know, too, that he was only in his coat, trousers, and shoes, because we found his shirt and his socks on the floor of his room, and he took his bicycle with him. Heidegger came to the school a year ago. He's a good teacher, but the boys don't like him because he isn't very friendly. So, Mr. Holmes, we have 2 missing people. It's now Thursday, and there's still no news of them. Holmes took out a little notebook and began to write things down. The boy didn't go home, of course, he said. No, we asked at Holderness Hall at once, said Dr. Huxtable. The Duke is very afraid for his son, and I am the unhappiest man in England. Mr. Holmes, you are a famous detective. Please help me. You make things very difficult for me, Holmes said. How can I find marks in the ivy or on the ground after 3 days? Why didn't you come to me at once? Because of the Duke, Dr. Huxtable said. He doesn't like people talking about his unhappy family life, and what are the police doing? Well, they heard about a boy and a young man at the station early on Tuesday. They looked for them, and last night they found them in Liverpool, but it was a man and his son going to visit a friend. We lost 3 days because of that. And last night I couldn't sleep, so I took the first train down to London this morning. Well, Dr. Huxtable, some more questions, said Holmes. Did the boy take German lessons? No, so he didn't know the German teacher well. Then he probably never spoke to him, said Dr. Huxtable. Mem, said Holmes. Does the boy have a bicycle? No. Was any other bicycle missing? No, so. Did the German teacher ride away on his bicycle in the night with the boy on his back? I don't think so. But what happened to the bicycle? Now, what about visitors? Did the boy have any visitors the day before? No. Did he get any letters? Yes, one letter. From his father. Do you open the boy's letters? Dr. Huxtable. No. Then how do you know that the letter was from the father? I know the Duke's handwriting. And he says that he wrote a letter to his son. Did the boy get any letters from France? No, I never saw any. Do you understand me? Dr. Huxtable. Holmes said. Did someone take the boy away, or did the boy go freely? Because he had a letter from France, perhaps, I don't know, said Dr. Huxtable. He only had letters from his father. I think were father and son very friendly. The Duke is not. Yeah. Not a very friendly man, Mr. Holmes. He's not a bad father, but he is a government minister and has a lot of things to do, so the boy felt more friendly to his mother. Yes. Did he say that? No. Did the Duke tell you? Then? Oh, no. The Duke never talks about things like that, so how do you know Mr. James Wilder? The Duke's secretary told me. I see, said Holmes. That last letter of the Duke's, where is it now? The boy took it with him, Dr. Huxtable said. It's not in his room. Mr. Holmes, our train leaves in half an hour, right, said Holmes. He looked at me. Watson, let's get ready and go off to the north with Dr. Huxtable. Perhaps we can find some answers to this mystery. Chapter 3. Holmes and Watson go north. It was dark when we arrived at Dr. Huxtable's famous school in the northern hills. We went quickly into the building out of the cold, and at once someone ran up with news for Dr. Huxtable. He looked very surprised. The Duke is here, he told us. The Duke and Mr. Wilder, his secretary, are in my office. Come and meet them. The government minister was a tall man with a long, thin face. He had red hair and a great red beard. He looked at us and did not smile. Next to him stood Mr. Wilder, a very young man. He was small, with blue eyes and a watchful face. He spoke first. The Duke is surprised, Dr. Huxtable, to see Mr. Sherlock Holmes here. He doesn't want people to know about this. You know that? So why didn't you speak to the Duke before you went to London? But we need help, said Dr. Huxtable. And I. Well, said the Duke. Mr. Holmes is here now, and perhaps he can help us. He looked at Holmes. I'd like you to come and stay at Holderness Hall. Mr. Holmes. Thank you, sir, said Holmes. But I would like to stay near to the mystery, here at the school. Can I ask you one or two questions? Perhaps he had with him a large map. He brought it into my room and put it on the bed. This case is beginning to get interesting, Watson, he said. Look at this map. Here is the school, you see, and here is the road. So did the boy and the teacher go along the road when they left? No, Watson, they did not. How do you know that? Holmes, I asked. Because there was a policeman here, look. He was there from midnight to 6 in the morning, and he saw nobody on the road. I spoke to him this evening, and here at the other end, you see, is the White Horse Inn. A woman there was ill, and the family watched the road all night, waiting for the doctor. The doctor didn't come until the morning, and the family saw nobody on the road. So the boy and the teacher did not go by road. But Holmes, what about the bicycle? I asked. Yes, Watson, we must remember the bicycle, of course. But first, let's look to the south and the north. To the south we have a big river, no bicycles there then. And to the north we have the trees, called Ragged Shore, and then a great moor, the Lower Gill Moor. Just then Dr. Huxtable came quickly into the room. "News, Mr. Holmes," he said excitedly. I bring news. In his hands was a blue school hat. "Look, this is the boy's hat. One of my gardeners found it this evening where asked Holmes. Just north of Ragged Shore," said Dr. Huxtable. "Aha," said Holmes. "What did I tell you, Watson? Tomorrow we must walk north across the moor." Chapter 4. Sherlock Holmes Talks to the Duke. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Holmes and I were in the Duke's office at Holderness Hall. Mr. Wilder came to speak to us. "The Duke can see no one today," he said to Holmes. Holmes looked at him coldly. "The Duke can see me," he said. "Please tell him that I am here." After half an hour the Duke of Holderness came into the room. He looked older, tired and ill. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said. Holmes looked at James Wilder. "I can speak more freely without your secretary here, sir." "Very well," said the Duke tiredly. "Please, James." James Wilder gave Holmes an angry look, but he went out of the room and shut the door. Holmes looked at the Duke. "You are offering, I hear, £5,000 for news of your son, true, and another £1,000 for the name of the kidnapper, true?" My friend smiled. "I see your checkbook on the table, sir." "I would like to have your cheque for £6,000, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the Duke said angrily. "What is this about? Do you have news of my son or not?" "Oh, yes," said Holmes. The Duke's eyes never left Holmes's face. "Where is my son?" he said quietly. "He is, or was last night, at the Green Man Inn, 3 kilometers along the road to Chesterfield." The Duke fell back in his chair. "And the name of the kidnapper?" Sherlock Holmes's answer was a very surprising one. "You," he said. "And now, sir, your cheque, please." The Duke stood up, his face white and angry. Then he sat down again and put his face in his hands. It was some minutes before he spoke. "How much do you know?" he asked. "I saw you with him last night," said Holmes. "And how many people know about this?" "Only I and my friend here, Dr. Watson." The Duke took out a pen, opened his checkbook, and began to write. "When I made this offer, I didn't know." He stopped, then began again. "Are you and your friend going to talk about this, Mr. Holmes?" "I don't understand you, sir," said Holmes. "I mean, nobody needs to know about this little family mystery, just you and your friend Watson." "Look, here is my cheque for £12,000. Holmes gave him a cold little smile. "I'm sorry, sir. There is a dead man in this case." "You remember, but that wasn't James," cried the Duke. "He knew nothing about it. He was very, very unhappy when he heard about the killing murder," said Holmes. "But James wasn't there, and when he heard about it, he came to me at once and told me everything." "Oh, Mr. Holmes, you must help him, you must. He is not the murderer." "The murderer ran away last night." Holmes smiled again. I have a little more news for you, sir. The police met Mr. Reuben Hayes last night at Chesterfield Station. Mr. Hayes is not running anywhere. For a very long time the Duke looked at Holmes with an open mouth. You know everything he said. But I am pleased to hear about Hayes. He was always a bad man. And that news can only help James. James? Your secretary, said Holmes. No, sir. My son. James Wilder is my son. Chapter 5. The Duke's Son. When the Duke said this, I was very surprised, but Holmes was surprised too. This is news to me, he said. Can you tell me more? The Duke stood up and walked round the room for a minute. I must tell you everything, he said. I didn't want to talk about it, but I must. I see that now. He sat down again and began his story. When I was a young man, Mr. Holmes, I was in love. Oh, so much in love. It only happens to you once, and this woman was the love of my life. I wanted her to be my wife, but she died. She left me this one child, and I loved him because of her. When I look in his face, I see her and remember her and can't stop loving her. I must have the boy near me because of this. But a government minister cannot tell the world about a loved child like this. So to the world, James is my young secretary, not my son. Well, Mr. Holmes, I knew nothing about any of this until the murder. James is a bad boy, but he does not murder people. When he heard the news, he came to me at once, crying, "What could I do? I didn't want the world to know about this." So James went down to the Green Man. He told Hayes to run away, because everybody knew about the murder now and knew the murderer's name too. Hayes left at once. Later I went down and saw Arthur. I left him there with Mrs. Hayes because I couldn't say anything to the police just then. So, Mr. Holmes, now you know everything. Said Holmes. You help a murderer. You say nothing to the police. You leave your young son in a dirty inn. And you ask for my help. People never spoke to the Duke of Holderness like this usually. His face was red, but he said nothing. First said Holmes, "We must bring Arthur home." "Yes," the Duke said quietly. Holmes quickly wrote a note and took it out of the room. A minute later he was back. "Now, what are you going to do about Mr. James Wilder?" he said. "I understand you, Mr. Holmes," said the Duke. "James is leaving me and going to Australia next week." "Good," said Holmes. "And the Duchess?" "Perhaps without James in the house, you and she—" "Yes. I wrote to the Duchess this morning." Holmes stood up. "Well," he said, "Watson and I can go home now, I think. There is just one other small thing. This man Hayes took 2 horses across the moor, but the horses' feet made the tracks of a cow in the mud. How was this possible?" The Duke looked surprised and thought for a minute. Then he went away and came back 2 minutes later with a glass box in his hands. In the box were some horseshoes. "We found these shoes under the ground in the garden," the Duke said. "They are about 500 years old, we think. The Holderness family has a long and interesting past." Holmes opened the box and took out one shoe. It was a shoe for a horse's foot, but it looked like a cloven cow's foot. Holmes wet his finger and ran it round the bottom of the shoe. A little mud came off on his finger. "Thank you," said Holmes. He put the horseshoe back in its box. "That shoe is the second most interesting thing in the north of England," he said. "And the first?" asked the Duke. Holmes took the cheque for £12,000 from the table and slowly put it into his notebook. "I am a poor man," he said. He looked lovingly at the notebook, then put it carefully in his pocket.